Hello everyone, I am Alex, currently a doctoral candidate at NUS Business School in Singapore and head of scenario consulting at Shaping Tomorrow. And today I'm having a chat with Tessa Cramer. Tessa recently completed her PhD with a super interesting thesis titled Becoming Futurists, Reluctant Professionals Searching for a Common Ground at Maastricht University. In this study, she offers insight in what we can learn from the mindset of futurists. Tessa also teaches futures thinking at Fontys Academy of Creative Industries, Nyenrode, and University College Amsterdam. Tessa also co-founded the Trend Research Lab to translate the future to the general public. Welcome, Tessa.
Thank you. Thank you for this kind introduction.
Oh, it's really a pleasure to be talking to you today, Tessa. I think your work is a wake-up call to many of us in the Futures and Foresight community, because it is just really necessary to study the mindset of Futures and Foresight professionals. But this topic is literally sitting outside of the debate in our community. So I read your thesis and I just love that you exposed what seems to me as a set of obstacles for professionals in our field to develop as a distinct profession. So I wanted to have a public chat with you about some key insights of your work, because I think this is really of interest to the Futures and Foresight community at large. So why don't we just jump right in and talk about your findings? I'm so excited about this. Why don't you tell us, what does it mean that futurists, which I guess it's a word we agree we use in lack of a better word, are reluctant to professionalize?
Yes, indeed. First of all, in the definition was actually part of the process of my PhD. So I try to refer to futurists, but every time I spoke to a futurist, they mentioned a different job title. So I decided in the end, okay, futurist is a word that everyone in our community understands, probably won't use for their own practice, but we are talking about professionals that are systematically researching the future and sell that, for example, or create strategy. So this is indeed important to start with, because sometimes it can put colleagues off.
For the ease of communication, right?
Yes, exactly. It's important to, and maybe also when we're having a scholarly discussion, it's very important to be very clear about who are we talking about. So yeah, what is interesting is that you right away, you have been reading my thesis well, because reluctance is a word that I use often, but I only got to that word after a while. So in the beginning, when I started the conversations, maybe it's good to also explain, I started this PhD, I started to pursue the PhD because I noticed that there was so much interesting work that was done by futurists, but I also noticed that their reputation wasn't always the best. So, for example, when I was reading newspapers in the Netherlands, we have quite a tradition in futures thinking. I often noticed that futurists were depicted as crystal ball gazers, for example. So I was curious about this, like how can a topic that is part of all of our lives, the future, it's so important. How can it be that somehow the people that are working with it are having difficulties to explain the value of it, and also of their own role. So that was the reason why I started to work. So I started to do interviews and observe futurists, and I had to find a sort of framework in how can I understand these futurists. And that was not an easy task, to be honest. So I went back to my own roots. I'm a sociologist, and I realized that I can use this framework that I have been taught to help understand who are those futurists. And in the beginning, when I started these conversations at, for example, professionalization conferences, so there were a few conferences at the World Futures Federation, but also the World Futures Society, La Futura, very different conferences. I went there and I observed who are talking, who are having this conversation about not only our profession, but also about theory and methods, and what are these discussions about. And what I noticed was that there was quite some activity. also in journals. So I started my research also reading a lot of literature, and I saw there was discussion about our profession, but it was a discussion that had kind of a circular reasoning in the discussion. So it didn't really. I saw over the years. It started around the 60s, and it's still going on now. But I noticed that these discussions weren't really progressing. And I started to wonder, yeah, how can we understand that? So I started to talk to the futurists. I interviewed an international community because I also saw there's like no boundaries. Futurists are everywhere in the world, which is beautiful. And I started to see that the futurists really had a longing to be understood, also in their role, the role that they can play. But they, at the same time, were showing me this unwillingness, almost a little bit of activism, which I found very interesting and intriguing. Like, what is that? And I couldn't grasp it right away. So at first, the conversation was really about diversity. So most of the futurists told me, like, I have my practice, but you can't compare it to any other futurist. And this was something that some futurists really honored, and other futurists were telling me, this is a very big problem because we don't have like a common ground. We don't have this common vocabulary. We don't even have one word for our fields.
Right.
Yeah, and I started to unpack this word. So the unwillingness, I realized it's reluctance. And in Dutch, we don't have this word. So I was really happy to write my thesis in English because reluctance
is a perfect word. Yes, I agree.
Yes, it's a word that also really suits the futurist because it shows the unwillingness to do something or to adhere. And this was actually the core of my research, or the core of my work, that I was able to kind of lift the veil of this this underlying current. And the reluctance.
The interesting thing to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that this unwillingness goes against their desires, or I could say our desires, right? The interesting thing is that there is a conflictual dynamic there, right? Because we sort of understand it's necessary to professionalize, to be understood, right? But then somehow, and then you'll tell us why, we don't want to do it. This is just quite puzzling, right?
That's puzzling.
The conflict
And that's
itself.
exactly, yeah, and that's also why this discussion wasn't able to progress. Because what happened was, when I started to look at the framework of sociology, I noticed that the words that the futurists used really fitted into one of the most traditional views on becoming a profession. So around the 1950s, there was quite a lot of work about traits. So it's very simply put, it's like a checklist of things you need to do. For example, create a code of conduct.
To be a professional, right?
Yeah, create an organization, organize your community. And all these things are somehow also, and that's something that I have really learned, at a societal, not even futurists, but actually, if futurists already have these ideas in their minds, then all of us do. Like, we have this very old idea of what a profession is. And what I'm showing with my work is that the futurists are an example of work today, of professions today, which is very different than what we know as a profession. But if you don't have these sort of, I was able to like zoom out. So I was teaching future studies. I was telling young students, how do you do this work? Which methods can you use? I was explaining them. So I needed to understand myself how to do this work. But I wasn't actually totally involved in the field, which made it a role of reflection. And I could take this distance and give it meaning and help futurists to understand that what the futurists are doing is actually very good and interesting if they start to see it themselves too.
So why don't we unpack a bit more the reasons that you found to be the cause of this reluctancy in your work? I'm sure there are a lot of reasons, but your work did uncover a few key salient reasons, right?
Yeah. Yes. So the cause of the reluctance. It started with this unwillingness. So I started to see it there and in their diversity. And what I did with the reluctance, I started to follow it in a way. So I used a very qualitative approach in which I started also, I observed, I interviewed, and I facilitated group discussions. And in these conversations, I tried to grasp, okay, this reluctance tells me a lot. It's a very valuable source. It's my gold of the research. How can I give it meaning? So I started to look for themes. Actually, I started to look for the pathway of the futurists. So which pathway are they choosing to professionalize? Which was a difficult pathway. It was, I have been searching for years to really grasp like this first bit. And actually, I think there is much more to explore. So this was really my first effort. And the themes that I identified were discussions around identity. So what is the common ground if you're not the same? That's a very important topic. The other theme, it's three. The second theme is reputations. So how do futurists build reputations in different worlds at the same time, which sounds complicated, but for futurists, it's very easy. I noticed that right away, like, hey, for example, you're writing a PhD at a business school. That's an example, like futurists do that. you're
One of a kind.
worlds. Yeah, one of a kind, and also connecting worlds. And the third theme is also an important one, is about the service that futurists offer. So there's a lot of emphasis in how futurists are approaching their own knowledge and their own work. So I at first wanted to do a discourse analysis to sort of compare work, for example, of several futurists, but I realized this is not what it's about. The diversity should be honored. It's much more about how futurists deal with knowledge in their work. And this is not just about sociology, it's also about more scholarly fields of science and technology studies, which is more about new technologies and how we relate to new knowledge. And futurists are often a topic of these scholars because futurists are doing things so differently that they are very interested to learn about them. So this last theme was really about futurists don't have a common knowledge base. So for example, you have grown to be a futurist, you take the scholarly route, but are also connected to the business world. What is important is that you have your own experience, but you also draw from, I call it a knowledge reservoir instead of a knowledge base. So you have been building on this sort of expanding reservoir of different information. So you are connecting to other futurists, you are writing articles, you are doing all kinds of different things to create this reservoir you can draw from when, for example, a client approaches you and asks you, how can I understand the future or futures? So these three themes were very, like, they came to the fore, and I tried to approach them with, for me, this was also a challenge because sociology gives a lot of frameworks and tools, but I also noticed I need to approach this group very differently. So the futurists were navigating me into these new topics, and I compared to the traditional way of looking at the sociology of professions. I used that also to show, like, hey, these futurists are doing it so differently. We need to respect that reluctance, and we need to honor it. And probably the futurists are not the only ones who are experiencing this reluctance. So they are also not alone.
Understood. So these themes that you uncovered, right? would you go as far as to say that they are the causes of the reluctancy, or in a true social constructionist, say, viewpoint, you abstain from saying, oh, those are the causes, because the reality is more complex than that. It's an interrelation of factors. What is your point of view in terms of pinpointing the reasons? Maybe your point of view is we cannot pinpoint the reason, or maybe you tell me.
Yeah, I have the I'm a social constructivist, so for me, indeed,
I kind of sense that.
yeah, it's very like I wouldn't go there
All right, got it.
to mention the causes. I observed this phenomenon, and
That's what you observe, right? That's
yeah,
what you observe, given your perspective, which you acknowledge. I got it.
yeah.
Well, which is still kind of, I mean, it is still very informative. If you treat it as a cause, you can possibly derive some guidelines, and if you do not treat it as a cause, it is still informative because it's a profession that is completely new, and right, so you might inform other professions or the field of the sociology of professions. This diversity interests me a lot. You talk a lot about diversity, and something that you just mentioned, which I don't think you mentioned in the thesis, but I might be wrong because I don't remember every word, so sorry for that. You just said it's important that we value this reluctancy. You almost like, correct me if I'm wrong, you say this is something to keep there and to study more, perhaps, but it's not something to discourage. What is your point of view of reluctancy? I mean, do you wanna attach a value to that? Is it negative? Is it positive? Do you see it as negative or positive? Do you think people should see it as negative or positive for giving guidelines? Or is it just something that, again, you observe, you detach yourself from the phenomenon, it's there?
I've written the thesis, so I can
Right.
say things about it now. I can't say it in the lines, of course, but yeah, the reluctance was indeed my goal. So it's I noticed in other scholarly work that this reluctance was actually the reason why people stopped researching. So it was my start, but for most it was the end. And I think that's a very important sort of shift in mindset, in how like unwillingness doesn't mean that the futurists don't want to professionalize, but the unwillingness was really in, and that's very important, in they didn't want to adhere to the norm that was standard.
I got it. They don't want to professionalize in the traditional manner.
Exactly.
They might want to professionalize in a novel manner, which is not there yet.
Yes.
Okay.
And of course, because there are like also on a societal level, there are not many tools to do it differently. Like our education systems don't learn, like if you're lucky, you're in a school that's really helping you to learn, find new pathways and create maybe new systems. But for example, when you look at elementary school, high schools, those curricula have been the same for over 100 years, like often. Not everywhere, of course, I cannot generalize that, but I noticed that our education doesn't bring us like I have a favorite book. It's not scientific at all. It's Becoming Wise by Krista Tippett, and she's a journalist, and she has been talking to a lot of super interesting people, and she brought that all together in this book. And what I actually learned, and maybe already from the title, and that's also why I titled my PhD Becoming Futurists, is that there's a very, we forgot in education that people are becoming, and that every person has their own way of becoming, and we don't have to be the same. But somehow we have decided that we should be the same to be recognizable. That futurists should be there should be some similarity between them. Otherwise, people won't understand it. And it's a very this is new territory. Also in science, like how do you deal with that as a sociologist, as a futurist? How do you deal with being different, and how can you honor
Absolutely.
that? Yeah.
Yeah,
So
honor it. The word I was groping for, right? You want
yeah.
to honor this reluctance, so to speak. I mean, maybe it's not the perfect, ideal way to say it, but
Yeah.
yeah. Well, let's talk about the usefulness of having a common ground. We have uncovered, thanks to your work, we have uncovered that. I mean, it was clear, but now we do know it better and in more detail that we don't have a common ground, and that is we don't have a common ground in trainings, we don't have a common ground in point of views, and so on and so forth. Do you think this is bad? I'm gonna be transparent with you. I think this somehow is quite bad, because if I think of other disciplines, right, and think about sociology, at least, for instance, which you're familiar with. Well, we do have a common ground of theories. We do have a common ground of, we know there are a few epistemologies which might be in disagreement with each other, but there is scholarship on that. And then people build on, and researchers build on each other's work. And that is the way that the discipline incrementally improves, right? So I don't see that in Futures and Foresight and in Futurists. So I personally believe this somehow is not so good. It's quite detrimental. What is a point of view of that? I mean, maybe we don't have to have a common ground, but we still need to have a way to improve the discipline incrementally so that we are better understood, right? What do you think?
I would separate I find it interesting that you describe how you look at it, because it's very common to look at it like that. Like many people told me this too. And what I started to do was trying to unravel what exactly is common ground. So there is definitely this knowledge part that I
Theories
described.
and methods, right?
Yeah. So this is a problematic part, because it's indeed there's no in knowledge there's no knowledge base to say so. So for example, at one point I also presented this finding, or it wasn't a finding, it was more an observation at a conference of the WFSF in, I think it was Turku, a few years ago, and I described, like, futurists, for example, have difficulties describing who are founding fathers and mothers. So they didn't have this common narrative of a history together. And I described this, and one of the futurists present was a very vocal futurist who is also in the scholarly community, worked at Oxford at the time. And she was angry with me. So she was, I also write this in my second chapter, like, well, angry is a big word, but she was like, have you talked to the right futurists? And I understood her. I understood her doubt. Like, how can you say that? And it's also confronting. Like, why don't futurists know? And the interesting thing was, well, they all had their own perspective. So some futurists said, we already started our work when there were fortune tellers. The Delphi oracles. But there's other futurists that say, oh, it started all with Wells in the beginning of the last century. So there's just different ideas of what we as a community are. I sometimes also say we, because I do feel very connected. So that's the reason why I do that.
No problem.
But there's, at the same time, I also saw that this can also kind of stop a conversation or growth. So when you identify we don't have this base, it's very difficult to go from there. So I saw something else happening that I found interesting, which is also about this becoming a futurist, is that all the futurists do have their own knowledge base. And I think there is, when we become more aware of the importance of commonality, of common ground, it will, I do believe, I'm very hopeful that there will be this knowledge reservoir, that we have them individually, but can we create something together? and that's accessible for all futurists and maybe for anyone to start working on. Okay, what is it that we have in common on theory and methods? What is important to know is that it's not the only thing that you can create common ground on. So I also describe in my work that, for example, when I ask futurists about their skills, what do you have to be able to do when you are a futurist? They were really outspoken. It was the most easy question for them. So the question on founding fathers and mothers was like, they were like, what? They didn't prepare for that. But when I asked, okay, what is, for example, the capabilities that you need to have to be able to do this work well? Describe futurists that you find inspiring. What type of person is that? Or what type of characteristics has this professional? And I noticed that there was like not maybe common ground in the specific answer, so they don't all give me the same answers. But what I did see was that it's something that they have been so, like they had to think about it a lot. They had to explain their work a lot. So they had to, there was so much awareness there, and also similarities in, for example, describing that it's not just about skills, but also about mindset, and that it's really about opening new worlds for others. And pinpointing skills would be too limited. They say we need to think bigger, and we have this anti-disciplinary mindset, and we're like imaginative. That's a very different type of mindset or skill set than your usual profession. So this is a very nuanced discussion about, I wouldn't ever say there's no common ground. I think indeed there is work to do in common understanding of histories. There's work to do in where are we together, also in service and knowledge stands. But there's definitely already maybe, and that's maybe even, I don't dare to weigh importance, but I think I got very hopeful that I had this conversation and started to notice there is so much commonality in how these people are looking at the world, but that's much more difficult to grasp or to really pinpoint like we can with knowledge. So that's something that we can also maybe open up a little bit also in our discussions. Like how can you, value that?
I see that you are also proposing somehow a way to find a common ground, but this common ground is, again, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm trying to rephrase, it's not along the way of established professions common ground. So instead of looking for the traditional common ground, which might be along the lines of theories and methods that everybody knows, maybe we need to find a common ground that is still common, but different, right? Maybe it's a common ground of mindset. Maybe it's a common ground of, I don't know. We don't know. But then the question and the challenge becomes, how do we professionalize given that new novel common ground of the new kind of profession, and how do we make it clear and known to everybody? I mean, I guess we somehow agree that we need to find a common ground. Maybe I'm more of this on the scientific side, right? Saying, hey, we need to find a common ground of the theory and the methods, more rigorous. But you say, well, yeah, maybe we need to find a common ground, but it's more about the way we approach things. Right.
Yeah,
That's interesting.
Exactly. Yeah, and I find it interesting that also you ask me like how to move forward from this, because
right.
Yeah, and that's a very important question, because I started at the end of my research. I realized that in science or in sociology, for example, there's this type 1 professionalization. I don't really like to use that word. It derived from STS, mode 1, mode 2 type of knowledge, which has this similar idea, but that's not really interesting actually for this discussion. But what I try to define the futurist as a type 2 profession, so a different type of profession, which we should see, and only already seeing it helps. But I did notice that it was difficult for me to, like, I identified this first sort of contour, but it's not, we need more work on this. Like, we need more perspective, we need more conversation, we need more critical thinking about how to proceed this first. Like, I took a step into a direction. I opened up themes that were already existent. So for example, I noticed that, or I of course observed other work in this direction. And for example, Andy Hines, who's based in Houston, is doing really incredible work also with the APF, the Association of Professional Futurists. What they are doing, for example, is creating a
competency model. Yes.
Competency model.
Absolutely.
And I also cited on that in my work, because it's so interesting to see that this also really implies, it really emphasizes the focus on mindset, or like what kind of competencies, what do you need?
What do you need? That's right.
Yeah, so also skill based. And I think that work is already, it's going on. It's not the whole community that's working on it, but that's not necessary. That's never the case. So there is definitely an urgency to start opening up these new discussions and really move them forward, and be able to also, like the futurists are doing this work actually for others. So can we do it for ourselves?
Right, facilitate our own profession, so to speak.
Yeah.
So practically speaking, what would you? Okay, now I'll just giving you the leader hat, right? You are in charge of designing. Maybe you, as a social constructionist, you will abstain from that, but you're in charge of designing the next steps, the next few steps, to bring this forward towards professionalization, bring Futures and Foresight forward towards a professionalization. What would you advise? I know this is a tall order, right? But
it is, but I do find it a very interesting question, because it also gives some insight in the thoughts that I had about it. And I actually noticed after publishing my PhD, like, it really resonated within our community. So I was blown away by it, because I had been doing this work, like you write you know about this, you write a PhD behind your computer on your own. And when I started going out into the world, I also realized that futurists are not alone. So I was also approached by competitive intelligence professionals.
Good response.
That are also in this sort of in-between sort of gray area. So what I first would recommend is have these conversations. Have these conversations. So, for example, I noticed that at conferences, it's difficult to claim a lot of time for this topic. This is something that I would recommend right away, like make time, like to reflect on your practice every time you meet with other futurists, even if it's on a small scale, because it's something that we need to do to be able to consolidate our roles, to understand our roles, and to really live our roles. That we have so much potential in the work that we do. And I noticed that because we're not having these very sort of fundamental conversations yet, it's difficult. So I would start there. Like, let's move these conversations forward. And also based on my sixth chapter on knowledge, I would definitely be very interested to see, like, how can we create this common knowledge reservoir? Like, how can we bring together? Because I also noticed in my conversations with other professionals that are connected to us, like strategists, that there is a necessity to start understanding what is our roots, like where do we come from. And I think there's in the field also probably people that are looking at our conversation that know that, but they also like
well, it's not widespread enough. I mean, I'm sure there is a bunch of futurists or futures and foresight professionals who know it really well, but then the majority might be in disagreement. Where did we start? And so on. So agree, make it more widespread, right?
Yeah, and also and that's something broader, that also on a societal level we need to explain our value, and also to be able to do that you need to know your own value. So the roles of futurists are very specific, but they are very, like, especially in these times. I have this. I also think that that's the reason why my thesis was so well received, because it's so necessary to reflect and to just be able to explain a different new pathway to the outside world. Because
Absolutely.
I'm very convinced that also on a societal level we help others too, the strategist and the competitive intelligence professional. So it's something that needs to be done, and I think the futurists are definitely a group that would be able to do that. Yeah.
But in what you just said, to me, there is a lot of opportunity and at the same time, a lot of risk. Because when you say that a profession is reluctant to professionalize, you mean that on one hand, they might be very useful, and they are, but if we are reluctant to comply to the establishment, so to speak, which we are, right, for various reasons, then we might somehow self-sabotage our own way to be understood. Right. I see this. I mean, yes, you said that many people have discussed about the profession of futurists before, and I love Andy Hines' works. But you were the first to uncover this conflict, right? And to me, this conflict is something I was dwelling on for a while, because I think at the end of the day is about I see some barriers that we are imposing on ourselves. Because maybe, yes, you're right, we need to find a common ground that is new, is novel. No other profession have that kind of common ground. But maybe the very people that we want to influence, that we want to have an impact on, are just waiting for us to explain us in the old common ground style. So for me, this is just it's a self-sabotaging sort of conflict that I don't know how we're going to solve. To be honest, this is interesting by itself, but it is also a kind of a source of, problems.
Yeah, very interesting perspective. It's also I wrote a lot about the commonality of appreciating crossing boundaries. So futurists, they all have different reputations, and I couldn't say, oh, there's, like, also futurists wouldn't tell me there's one archetype, like there's just this one futurist and that's the futurist. And what I noticed was that there was common ground in the ability to cross boundaries, and I wrote that within worlds, so the artistic world, the commercial world, and the academic world. But what I didn't write about, I wanted to write about it, but it was too complex in that chapter. But what I found very interesting was that there's also worlds, old and new worlds, that also need to be crossed. So this is a very important aspect of futurist work. It's this gray area that we are in. We are in between worlds, and we see the new world, but we also see the value and the importance of the old world. So as a sociologist,
The weights of history, right?
Yeah. And also as a sociologist, I see the importance of systems, that we created these systems for a reason. We needed to organize ourselves. And especially when there's more and more people arriving on this world, we need them. But these systems don't always serve us anymore. So that's something that also Max Weber eloquently wrote about. He described that bureaucracy, which are systems, serves us in the way that we understand the world through rationality. So the world is understandable. You know where to go when you need a new passport, for example, in most countries. And what he described was that this also had an effect, that we disenchanted our world, that we have lost connection to, you could say, the magical or the more faith-based aspects of the world, the more spiritual world. And he described it, he observed it. So he didn't value one over the other, but he just described this is the way we have decided to organize our world. And when you look at the world right now, 100 years later, this is still, he said this in 1919, and this is still relevant today. It's still exactly the same situation. And I'm very curious that this new world isn't just rational. And it's also not just spiritual. I think it's a combination of being able to honor what we have around us. For example, honor our nature, honor different types of in between spaces that are not sometimes even explicable yet. And I think futurists are in their world, in their work, are there already. Like they have this connection already. They are doing this from a source that is not just rational, because the future isn't like it's not known. It's constructs. So how do you imagine these constructs? How can you help people to, to sort of get over their initial fear of thinking about futures that may be scary for them, but will have a lot of knowledge for them to be able to act in the present. So I see a lot of opportunity actually, but I'm also a very hopeful person. So maybe that's really my take. But I do see a lot of potential in the role of futurists in opening up this new world within the old world. So it doesn't have to, and I also say this in my PhD, type 1 doesn't, like type 2 doesn't conflict totally with type 1. It's connected to each other, but it's different. And I feel the same about the old and the new world. Like it's different but connected. And this connection needs to be made to be able to move forward together. And I think futures also have this responsibility to not let others go astray in what type of futures we need to strive for.
Yeah, right. If it's not us, who else? Absolutely. Very interesting, Tessa. Since we are approaching the end of our hour, I'd love to ask you a last question, which I think would be of interest to those hardcore ones who are still listening, which is about research. If you had to derive some further research directions for those who are interested in going further to build up on your work, right? What would you suggest? And also, if you have some stuff you are already working on as a follow-up on this thesis that you have just published, why don't you just share it with us?
Yes. Regarding the preceding like my work, I would definitely recommend others to also follow the reluctance and go deeper into the themes that are connected to the reluctance. So I saw these 3 themes, but I am very sure there are more. And that also I opened up this way of looking at our profession, but it's definitely just the beginning. So I see a lot of space and new ideas on how can you really, for example, think about this common grounds, or how do we work with knowledge? Can we also from other perspectives, can we work on that more? I also see that's for futurists. So that conversation needs to continue, and I hope that others will progress, or will move forward and will tell me, will debunk the things that I'm describing. I also see a lot of potential in sociology and science and technology studies. So for sociologists, what I do is I show they stopped at the reluctance and the unwillingness of futurists because they thought that's not an empirical case we can use. They are not a profession yet. I say, you're looking at it wrong. You need to be able to take new professions seriously and understand their value, which is different than traditional professions. So for sociologists, there's a lot of work too. I definitely that's the most, that has had the most impact on a scholarly level. And for science and technology studies, they work with boundaries a lot. So they are very interested in boundary work. What is on one side, what is on the other, how do you cross those boundaries? And what I added was that there's also people that like boundaries. So the futurists reside within the boundaries, like within this gray area between worlds. and they don't mind being there. And that's for these scholars really a new perspective of looking at that. So in my work, there's a lot of sort of starting points of thinking about, for futurists, for sociologists, and for science and technology scholars. So that's hopefully there will be traction, and I will definitely also, I wrote a manuscript, which is at my university normal to do, and because of that it's readable, but I would love to, next year I'm going to publish also in several journals to also address.
That's fantastic. So at the moment, if we want to read your work, I guess your thesis should be accessible, right?
Yeah.
How do we access it?
There's a link via Maastricht University. So if you Google my title, Becoming Futurists, and my name, you will find it via the library of Maastricht University. It's available for anyone.
Cool. So, well, I will also add that link on the description of this video for those.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, perfect.
No problem. That was fantastic, Tessa. I thank you so much for your time, and hopefully someone will pick up on your work and do more. Hopefully also thanks to this video.
Yes, thank you. Thank you also for the audience to stick with us.
Absolutely. Thanks to the audience. Thank you, Tessa. Take care.
You too.